Wreckfest is an all-out brawl of a racing game. Races are full contact, with track designs that encourage massive shunts as cars crisscross and shove other vehicles into barriers. Made by flat-out developer Bugbear Entertainment, Wreckfest represented a long-awaited return to form for demolition derby games, after over a decade without any serious attempts at the genre. After its initial version on PC, Wreckfest found its way to last-gen and current-gen consoles, and was just released on Nintendo Switch last week. Today we'll be taking a look at Wreckfest across all console formats, with a particular emphasis on the Switch and current-gen releases. Just how well can this game scale from Nintendo's hybrid console all the way to Series X? Wreckfest's claim to fame is its destruction. Vehicle damage is fully simulated here, with cars that realistically crumple and disintegrate as they collide. Crashes leave bits of fender and sheet metal strewn all over the track, and often send pieces of concrete barriers or tire walls into the air as well. Car deformation is satisfyingly granular and is a huge step up from typical racing fare. By default, most of this damage isn't terminal, so by the end of each race, most of the cars on track will be running with twisted rear ends or crushed engine blocks. Jockeying for position involves a healthy amount of pushing, shunting, and dodging vehicles. Avoiding enemy cars is important, as collisions leave you out of position and can reduce vehicle performance, though being aggressive with cars ahead is also crucial. Picking braking points and carefully engaging the throttle are equally important though. This is because the handling model combines weighty-feeling vehicles that demand some care when navigating corners, with some arcadey characteristics that prevent mistakes from being too punishing. Technically speaking, Wreckfest is a good-looking game, but it's not an especially technically ambitious title, outside of its superb car damage model. Looking at the Xbox One version of the game here, its strengths and limitations are clear. Wreckfest cars are highly detailed, regardless of their level of deformation. There's plenty of trackside geometry, and pop-in is minimal. On the other hand, indirectly lit shots can often look quite flat, perhaps indicating a lack of a GI solution. Car reflections are quite basic and seem to use static cube maps, so cars sometimes seem a little bit out of place, particularly in darker areas of the track. Plus, anti-aliasing is absent here, leading to a lot of shimmer in the final image. Bugbear started work on Wreckfest in 2012, and the game was developed by a smaller team of about 20 people, which perhaps explains some of these feature deficits. Plus, Wreckfest uses a proprietary game engine unique to Bugbear, so implementing these features may have incurred prohibitive development costs. But perhaps this combination of somewhat conservative rendering tech plus a custom, tweakable engine will lead to good results on the Nintendo Switch. Some of the best Switch ports have a similar lineage, like the Sniper Elite games. So how does Nintendo's hybrid system fare with Wreckfest? We're going to take a look at the Switch release first, and then work our way through the more powerful systems. At a glance, the Switch release doesn't seem to stray very far from the last-gen console versions. All the core rendering tech seems intact, and the game has a very similar overall look on Switch. Cars, trackside detail, shadow quality, draw-in. Without looking very closely for differences, the Switch release seems quite similar. Even the resolution, which is 1600 by 900 in docked mode, isn't far from the 1080p resolution on Xbox One. If you do take a more forensic approach to looking at the Switch release, the downgrades become more obvious. Most glaring is the reduction in texture quality. Textures take a big hit across the board, resolving with just a small fraction of their original detail. Some of the gags are rendered unintelligible as a result, like this bumper text. The texture work was clearly designed with higher resolution sampling in mind, and often doesn't scale especially well to Nintendo's memory-constrained platform. Foliage gets downgrades as well. The alpha-textured grass is gone, and the roadside trees are simplified. Trees no longer receive lighting or cast self-shadows, and they are less detailed, with low-resolution textures. Some other trackside details are moderately simplified as well, like the crowds. Car geometry appears to have been subtly streamlined too. The silhouette of the cars is still very similar, but on close examination fenders are boxier, exhausts are filled in, and seams have been smoothed out. Finally, there are some tweaks to post-processing. Most notably, motion blur is entirely absent on Switch. On the whole though, Wreckfest holds up very nicely on Nintendo's system. The cuts here are pretty minimal relative to other recent Switch conversions we've seen. This is a much more graphically complete and satisfying port than WRC 10, for instance. Performance is quite solid as well. Just like the last gen releases, 30 FPS is the target frame rate, which is mostly achieved. During gameplay, views with a lot of cars on screen can sometimes cause brief performance drops, as can certain dense sections of track. Replays are a bit more troublesome and often hit 20 FPS for extended periods. It does seem like Wreckfest is using a double buffer VSync setup here, so drops are very noticeable when they do occur. Frame rates are pretty consistent overall, so it's not much of a concern, thankfully. The portable mode does yield some surprises. Visual settings are essentially untouched, except for resolution of course, which falls from 900p to 960 by 540. Oddly though, this is upscaled to the Switch's 720p screen using nearest neighbor filtering, which preserves edge clarity by unevenly scaling the image to align with the pixel grid of the output resolution. We've seen this method of scaling used in a few major Switch titles in portable mode, including Astral Chain and the Assassin's Creed Ezio collection, and I can't say that I'm a fan. Without linear filtering, the image looks blockier than it needs to be and the scaling just draws more attention to the game's aliasing issues. The portable mode is generally good, and performance does seem to be roughly in line with docked play, but I do wish bilinear filtering had been used instead. On the whole though, this is a solid release. Wreckfest scales to the Switch with incremental compromises, not massive cutbacks. The game's visual makeup is very much preserved, and it looks attractive. On some level, this title seems well made for Switch, perhaps lacking some of the visual features that normally might be lost in translation to weaker hardware, but this still feels like a skillful conversion. So the Switch release is a success. Let's move up the performance ladder then and take a look at the last-gen console versions. The Xbox One release that we've been using as a comparison point against the Switch is essentially representative of all the last-gen console releases, at least in terms of underlying visual settings. Texture quality, models, and post-processing all fall in line with the Xbox One version on the 3 other last-gen machines, although shadow draw-in for vehicles and draw-in for grass are pushed out somewhat on the Pro and One X. Resolution is where the graphics really diverge. Base PS4 and Xbox One both turn in at 1080p resolution, without anti-aliasing, like all the other console versions of Wreckfest. PS4 Pro and Xbox One X also render at 1080p, at least in one of their respective modes. The PS4 Pro will run at 1080p if the console is set to 1080p output, and the Xbox One X renders at 1080p by default. One X and Pro do both offer higher resolution modes, however. The One X makes it fairly straightforward. Bumping a resolution toggle in the settings menu turns on a mode that renders at a full 4K, offering much improved image quality and clarity. Shimmer is still an issue, but detail is resolved much more cleanly on the X here. The PS4 Pro is a bit more interesting. When the console is set to 4K output, the PS4 Pro renders an 1800p checkerboard resolution, although the results are very poor. The image is covered in combing artifacts from the checkerboarding process, and the image often jumps from frame to frame, as if the game is showing you only one half of the checkerboarded resolution at a time. Very few of the edges actually manage to resolve at a clean 1800p, and the image reconstruction is basically non-functional. I much prefer the 1080p render here. Frame rates are quite good on last-gen machines. One X, PS4 Pro, and PS4 all turned in and essentially locked 30 FPS in my testing. The base Xbox One was mostly fine as well, but did drop frames a few times during gameplay and somewhat regularly in replays, drops which were accompanied by a bit of tearing in the top of the screen. It is possible that some of the more challenging late-game content could prove more taxing, however. After the release of the last-gen console versions in 2019, Wreckfest was fully upgraded for current-gen platforms in 2021. So what upgrades are in store there? The most obvious tweak is a change to color tone. This race looks quite a bit cooler, for instance, with a bluer and more vibrant color cast. In this scene, the darker colors are shifted towards blue as well, and distant foliage has a less sepia-toned look with greater contrast. I do prefer the new look and thought it might be an indication of a technical upgrade, but on closer inspection it really does seem to be more of a stylistic shift in color grading. It also closely matches the color tone of the PC release, which looks similar even on its lowest settings. But there are some real technical improvements here, with some incidental details seeing the biggest boost. The grass and bushes are rendered further into the distance and are much more dense. Alpha effects are stronger, and the dirt alpha effect now kicks up geometric dirt particles, which is a nice touch. Bloom lighting has been added too, which is most obvious against the horizon on bright tracks. Screen space light shafts also make an appearance, streaming through the trees when the sun is low. Finally, shadow draw distance is pushed out considerably. In these shots, every car on screen has visible shadow maps, even cars far afield from the player. PS5 and Series X push a full 4K resolution in addition to these boosts, while Series S sticks to 1080p. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like there's any anti-aliasing solution, leaving the game covered in aliasing artifacts just like the other console versions. The big win on current-gen consoles, however, is a boost to 60 FPS, doubling the frame rate target of the last-gen console releases. PS5 was essentially locked in my testing, hitting a full 60 FPS even in more busy moments. Series S did drop frames somewhat more regularly, though mostly confined to replays in my experience. There's the occasional dropped frame or two during gameplay, but they seem relatively minimal even on busy tracks. Series X struggles a lot more. Certain areas of track tend to provoke frame rate dips, which are accompanied by tearing near the top of the screen. Busy gameplay moments like race starts can also hit performance somewhat. Replays suffer as well, with extended bouts in the 50 to 60 FPS range. Now 60 FPS is in the cards the vast majority of the time during gameplay, but these moments do tend to stick out a few times per race. So the current gen console code for Wreckfest delivers a key boost, 60 FPS gameplay, plus incremental but appreciated settings tweaks to bump visual quality. Performance drops are a concern on Microsoft's consoles, however, and are curiously much more of a problem on the Series X. The pin-sharp precision offered by a raw 4K presentation is appealing, but perhaps the Series X should be cut down somewhat given the performance wobbles. Wreckfest is a good-looking game, but not a particularly graphically ambitious one. While the technical features may not be cutting edge, the game does look attractive in motion, particularly in directly lit conditions. The Switch really impresses, however. Nintendo's hybrid console gets a full-fledged conversion of the last-gen console release with few meaningful downgrades. None of the rendering fundamentals have been lost in translation, and the nips and tucks required to run the game on portable hardware are hard to notice at a glance. It's a breath of fresh air given the compromises present in other recent Switch conversions. Side by side with current-gen consoles, there's a solid degree of scalability. While the visual boosts are less fundamental and more incremental, Wreckfest does get a nice boost on the new machines. Last-gen consoles get a good rendition of the game as well. The only format that I'm not happy with is the PS4 Pro, which has a fairly broken 1800p checkerboard with heavy artifacting. More important than the technical minutiae, of course, is the fact that Wreckfest is a very good racing game, and is the only credible demolition derby-style racer in recent memory. This is a worthy successor to games like Flatout and Test Drive Eve of Destruction. Cars handle well, races are dynamic, and most importantly, the destruction is extremely well realized. Few other modern games can deliver the same catastrophic thrills. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. To view a high-quality version of this video, check out the Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch, just use Twitter. Thanks for watching.